The A Song of Ice and Fire fandom has a problem. I mean, it has many problems, but there's one that I've been thinking about recently, and I decided to share my thoughts on the matter on my TikTok. Because of all these resources, all those, wiki pages, all those famous essays, all those famous YouTube videos and whatnot, people stop thinking for themselves. And obviously I'm not saying that you should be a contrarian, that you should disagree with everything you see in those A Song of Ice and Fire spaces. No. But also, what you should not do is unquestionably believe every figure in the fandom that has some following. And it just so happens that in spite of the demographics of gender being roughly split in half, I would say, in the fandom, the vast majority of people who have actual big platforms and are actually considered important voices in the fandom come from the specific demographic of white dudes. People with platforms only coming from one specific demographic will make it so that certain crucial perspectives on the series will not be explored. And if they are explored, they will not be given as much weight. And what is even worse is that these perspectives will often be labeled as stan shit. Because unfortunately we live in a patriarchy. And it's a very important pillar of faith in the patriarchy that men are the rational and logical gender, whereas women are the irrational, emotional gender, which is patently false. The issue is that men believe that their emotions are objective and logical. And how that manifests itself in the A Song of Ice and Fire fandom is that these white dudes are met with such heavy reverence because their analysis is seen as completely impartial and completely objective. And I cannot stress enough how untrue this is, because human beings are not impartial. Human beings are not objective. There's numerous studies from psychology that prove this. People are putting into question things such as witness reports because people's memory is not objective. People have implicit biases that will influence how they perceive reality. And when it comes to A Song of Ice and Fire, as I said, these dudes will record their video essays or write their analysis in those impartial way. And most people will buy this unquestionably because they have the socially sanctioned benefit of the doubt on behalf of being white dudes. But very often, this analysis of theirs is gonna be equally biased, if not more biased, than those analyses made by some stans. Their standing of XYZ characters will be framed not as stunning and being biased, but as objective perception of the truth about these characters and events of the story. I see this a lot with Daenerys, obviously. The Overton window of how Daenerys is perceived by the fandom, how she's analyzed and spoken about, is so skewed that if you say a single positive thing about her, you're gonna be accused of being incredibly biased. So biased, such a biased, toxic extremist who obviously doesn't see that she's on a path of villainy and madness and she's gonna nuke everything on her path. And who decided that this is the case with Daenerys? Who told you this? And why did you believe in that? I'm not saying that I'm the one that's actually impartial and unbiased. I am, because I am a human being like you. But what I want to point your attention to is who is accused of being biased on a regular basis and who is always treated as the impartial voice of George R.R. Martin speaking through these people. Who gets to be treated as an objective analyst and who is always, and no exception, disparaged as biased, extremist, biased, stan, hysterical Dany fan or Arya fan or whatever. I looked back on another famous figure in the fandom who disappeared several years ago and now returned. If you know, you know. And I went back to his old analysis. I also saw quotes out of context. And I saw incorrect historical parallel applied to Daenerys specifically. And years after he wrote that essay, I still hear that Daenerys in Meereen is just like US in Iraq. Even though George R.R. Martin himself said that this is not what he was doing, that if he wanted to write about the Iraq war, he would do that. And see how this super impartial and objective analysis that is far from impartial, that is far from correct, I would even say, gets passed further, gets revered, gets repeated, and becomes the reading of the story. Because certain dudes don't really realize the biases they have. Because the fans do not realize the biases they have. And because this fandom really does not like perspectives other than the perspectives of white dudes. And a lot of this probably isn't malicious. A lot of this is probably just subconscious. If someone who doesn't fit that archetype appears, there's gonna be more scrutiny for them. Because obviously the only reason women and queer people could like a story is for stan reasons, right? They could not possibly have meaningful and insightful analysis, right? That's for white dudes.
There's really no solution to that. I know that the tide is shifting a bit. There's more perspective. It does not undo the damage that had already been done. Like, no matter what we're gonna do, we're still gonna hear the Iraq War claim. And what I'm gonna do is I will just continue to talk about Daenerys Targaryen and, other characters that I like, just to offer an alternative perspective. And like I said, it's not gonna be an unbiased perspective, just a different one. And I don't wanna be treated as the impartial voice of God. In fact, I kinda embrace my bias. So considering that everyone is biased, I think it's best that you as a reader make your own conclusions and seek out as many other perspectives as you possibly can, and from that form more conclusions. Do not rely on just me or just XYZ. Do not rely on those essays that you read online to be like, oh, that's the answer to everything. Read them, by all means read them, but don't accept them unquestionably. And if you can, seek out creators whose perspective is gonna be varied on behalf of their, gender or ethnicity or sexuality or gender identity, because that often gives people an additional insight that maybe you might have missed.
The person I specifically had in mind when making that video is a certain big-name fan, whose popular claim about the storyline of Daenerys in Slaver's Bay being an allegory for the Iraq War made rounds in 2013. I have long disagreed with this reading for the following reasons. 1. It is anachronistic, as A Storm of Swords was written and published years before the Iraq War. 2. It is apologetic towards US imperialism, as it presupposes that the US had good intentions in Iraq, but failed in execution, when in reality, the intention always was to flatten Iraq to the ground, steal its resources, and put the comprador class loyal to the US in charge. 3. It was suggested by a proud US Army veteran who has a vested interest in whitewashing the imperial crimes of his and his overlord. He still believes that, by the way. Let me elaborate on that TikTok video because there may be some misunderstanding as to what exactly I meant. I am not making an essentialist claim there, as I don't think anyone has inherent qualifications or lack of thereof to speak about certain issues. There are white dudes in this fandom whose insights I value greatly. Rather, what I meant is that the perspectives preferred and amplified in our space overwhelmingly come from that demographic, and the perspectives of others are overshadowed. Most crucially though, based on societal assumptions about said demographic, their insights are often treated as statements of fact rather than subjective opinions, in contrast to women in the fandom whose insights, no matter how text-based, how well thought out, and how eloquently expressed, are often disregarded as emotional ramblings of crazy stans. Compare and contrast how people react when, say, a female Daenerys fan says that she doesn't think that she is destined to go crazy and nuke everything on her path, with how little resistance there is to male Stannis fans, denying that he will burn his daughter in winds, even though only one of these plot points was confirmed by the author. In general, the implicit assumption is that anyone who isn't a white dude with a podcast has more bias than said white dude with a podcast, who is totally unbiased. And that is the root of my problem. However, I was informed that Daenerys is an allegory for the US in Iraq reading is not exclusive to that man, and that some post-colonial scholars suggest similar readings. I was recommended one such essay, The Silver Queen, US Imperialism and A Song of Ice and Fire, by Rachel M. Hartnett, published in the Journal of Popular Culture, Volume 54. I decided to practice what I preach and seek out other perspectives. On my TikTok, I offered my response to it, but it had to be condensed to fit the format, and there's a lot of points I removed or hadn't elaborated upon. So, I retrieved my earlier version of the Google Doc and then decided to expand on it even further, as here on YouTube I do not have any constraints. Real Phoenix Ashes extremists probably jumped in the air when they saw the length of this video. This all came amidst me writing a deep dive into slavery in A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones, touching upon the apologism towards it in the latter and the apologism of the fandom at large, which was planned as a 2-part series, but now it looks like it's gonna be a 3-part series. So, can Daenerys' actions in Slaver's Bay be read as an allegory for US imperialism? Let's find out. Before we start, remember that if you like my videos, like, subscribe and share, so that more people can see it. Make sure to click the notification button, so that you never miss a new video. Also, you can listen to this on Spotify if you prefer. Check the link in the description. My preferred historical inspiration for Daenerys' tenure in Meereen is the American Civil War and the Reconstruction. This reading was suggested by the late and great Stephen Attewell from Race of the Iron Throne in Laboratory of the Politics 6, published in the Tower of the Hand, and he was a white dude, no less. I will be citing this essay frequently, but I encourage you all to read it by yourself, as I consider it to be the singular best contribution to this entire fandom. One thing has to be addressed though. Martin took inspiration from different periods of time, because he is not crafting a historical novel, but a fantasy series. As such, this reading may seem contradictory at times because the Civil War and the Reconstruction dealt with racialized slavery, whereas the slavery of Essos is much like Greco-Roman slavery and thus is class-based. This is one of the reasons why it's not a one-to-one parallel. And while it was not officially endorsed by George R.R. Martin, the similarities are very strong and, most crucially, this reading drastically changes what lessons we should take from Meereen. If Daenerys' actions in Slaver's Bay are an imperial occupation, then the whole venture was likely to turn into quagmire, and peace should be sought immediately. However, if the correct parallel is the Civil War and Reconstruction, then peace and moderation are the wrong policy, emboldening former slave owners to oppress former slaves, allowing terrorist paramilitaries to form and overthrow democratically elected governments, and leading to almost a century of state-mandated discrimination and periodic pogroms. By contrast, the great historical what-if of Reconstruction is not what might have happened if the federal government had acted more moderately, but rather what might have happened if the federal government had followed through on the Second American Revolution, fully enforcing the civil and political rights of the freedmen and redistributing the land to equalize economic power in the South. Hartnett's essay is the first time I saw the Iraq War reading outside of the claims made by that man. And if you see the Iraq War claims in the wild, it will probably be his arguments that you encounter, as he is a figure active in the fandom, with platform and reverence. In general, few people in fandoms will engage in academic work. We do this for fun. At least theoretically, as I don't think anyone is actually having fun in this fandom. Most people would rather read posts on blogs, Reddit and Tumblr, or watch YouTube videos. And that's fine. We do not have to engage with academic work to have a valid understanding of the story. And considering that Stephen Attewell did have a PhD, his insights shouldn't be disregarded, even if it wasn't published in academic journals. I was informed that me having a critical response to that essay is in bad faith or even invalid because it was peer-reviewed. To which I ask, so what? As you will soon see, it's still full of inaccuracies regarding the lore, ripe with obfuscations, lacks sufficient follow-ups for certain arguments, instead expecting you to take them at face value, and sometimes contains straight-up lies. Academia is not a divine source that's given to us by some unseen impartial force, but by human beings with biases. Either the peer reviewers made mistakes because they're human beings who are allowed to overlook certain issues, or they were on board with the biased arguments this essay is making. If you're a channel regular, you know that this is a repeated pattern with how A Song of Ice and Fire fans engage with Daenerys Targaryen, and often it happens precisely in YouTube videos. I guess some things just never change. Several things to note before we begin. 1. I do not at any point question Hartnett's theoretical framework, but rather her arguments that are based on the text itself, something that can be done by anyone that's familiar enough with the source material. In fact, at one specific point, I criticize that her theoretical framework is insufficient. 2. Hartnett's arguments are not so much about the Iraq War itself, but about Daenerys being a stand-in for the general involvement of the United States in the Middle East. 3. I will not be quoting this essay in full. There will be parts that I will skip or paraphrase for the sake of cohesion, or because I have nothing to add or respond to. The essay opens with a quote from Daenerys 6, A Storm of Swords. No one was calling her Daenerys the Conqueror yet, but perhaps they would. Hartnett examines the historical inspiration for the books and adds, but perhaps more important than his use of history is the overt colonization and imperialism present in these historical events. This is particularly notable when considering the story of Daenerys Targaryen, one of the series' key protagonists. A large segment of the story follows Daenerys, the last princess of a noble line, who has been exiled from her kingdom of Westeros, often read as an analogue to England, as she travels throughout the barbaric continent of Essos. Daenerys eventually gains enough power to overthrow 3 major cities in Essos, Astapor, Yunkai and Meereen, collectively referred to as the Slave Cities or Slaver's Bay, freeing the enslaved citizens and installing herself as conqueror and queen. Someone unfamiliar with the source material might think that Dany is a colonial overlord moving through Essos with disdain and a sense of superiority, but that's not what happens. The continent of Essos as a whole is not at any point presented as barbaric, nor is it perceived in such a way by Daenerys. The writing of its non-white cultures, such as the Dothraki, is certainly orientalist and racist, but that is an oversight on behalf of the author. Daenerys herself is always respectful to the cultures she encounters. Following her marriage to Drogo, she is invited to share his Dothraki culture, to which she progressively assimilates to, grows to love and appreciate. She names blood riders, wears Dothraki garbs, her handmaids put her hair in a braid and give her bells. All Dothraki cultural practices. Similarly, in Karth, which is considered as standing above all other Isasi cities in terms of magical and technological advancement, further debunking the barbaric Essos claim, she wears the signature Karthin gown. She wears the traditional Giscari garment, the tokar, and gets married to his Dar Zolorak in Giscari rites. The Giscari also serve in her council. Skahas Mokandak, Hisdar Zolorak, and Galaza Galare are all her advisors. Dany's council is, in fact, the most culturally varied of all the leaders in this story. There's her Dothraki blood riders, the Nathi Missandei, the Giscari I mentioned, the Westerosi Jorah and Barristan, and others. What is even more, in the world of Planetos, Essos is overall the more advanced continent, both politically and technologically. Atawel too himself points this out. It's simply not the case that Dany, as a Westerosi, stands in a position of privilege over those of Essos. As I've said before, the power relations run the other way. Essos is far richer than Westeros, far more politically advanced, and considered more culturally advanced. And throughout world history, Westeros has been repeatedly conquered by invasions from Essos, and never the other way around. Thus, to assume that West equals rich, civilized, and East equals the other, because that's how it's been presented in the past, is falling into the same essentialist trap that Edward Said and others are critiquing. Again, that is not to say that the text itself isn't Orientalist at times, but that's the fault of the writer who, as a Western man living in the 21st century, certainly has some Orientalist biases he hadn't unpacked. However, that is a Doylist criticism, not a Watsonian one. A few notes on the term barbaric must be made here as well. Obviously, that word has a negative connotation, but it wasn't always the case. Barbaric used to be a neutral descriptor of a pre-civilizational societal order. In Origins of the Family, Angus differentiates between 3 stages of societal development. Savagery, the period in which man's appropriation of products in their natural state predominates. The products of human art are chiefly instruments which assist the appropriation. Barbarism, the period during which man learns to breed domestic animals and to practice agriculture, and acquires methods of increasing the supply of natural products by human activity. Civilization, the period in which man learns a more advanced application of work to the products of nature, the period of industry proper and of art. This word is uttered several times in Dany's chapter. Dragons did not mate with the beasts of the field, and Targaryens did not mingle their blood with that of lesser men. Yet now Viserys schemed to sell her to a stranger, a barbarian. Daenerys uses this word in that neutral context. Again, that term has obvious negative connotations for us and had been used disparagingly in the past as well, but curiously, that word is usually used by others to describe Daenerys. The mother of dragons must don the tokar or forever be hated. warned the Green Grace, Galaza Galare. In the walls of Westeros or a gown of Myrish lace, your radiance shall forever remain a stranger amongst us, a grotesque outlander, a barbarian conqueror. Meereen's queen must be a lady of old geese. No more than Meereen will accept Daenerys Targaryen as queen. The Green Grace has the right of that. I need a king beside me, a king of old Giscari blood. Elsewise they will always see me as the uncouth barbarian who smashed through their gates, impaled their kin on spikes, and stole their wealth. And in these two instances, that word is most certainly used in a derogatory manner we are all familiar with. To Hartnett's credit, she does put the word barbarian in quotation marks, but I think that the usage of that word is altogether misplaced. And before someone attacks me for pointing this out, I obviously think that this word is outdated and should be replaced by something else that does not have pejorative connotations, but words exist in context and it shouldn't be disregarded. There is another word with negative connotations that's used in Daenerys' POV, savage, but it is not Daenerys who uses it. I suppose, her brother said doubtfully. The savages have queer tastes. Boys, horses, sheep. Best not suggest this to Khal Drogo, Illyrio said. All these savages know how to do is steal the things better men have built. And kill, he laughed. They do know how to kill. Otherwise I would have no use for them at all. They are my people now, Danny said. You should not call them savages, brother. The dragon speaks as he likes, Viserys said, in the common tongue. He glanced over his shoulder at Aggo and Rakaro, riding behind them, and favored them with a mocking smile. See, these savages lack the wit to understand the speech of civilized men. The princess must be presented to the Doshkalin, the crowns, yes, her brother interrupted. And there's to be some mummers show of a prophecy for the whelp in her belly, you told me. What is that to me? I'm tired of eating horse meat, and I'm sick of the stink of these savages. I am the Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, not some grass-stained savage with balls in his hair, Viserys spat back at her. In A Clash of Kings, Dany thinks. Her Dothraki called the Carthaean milkmen for their paleness, and Khal Drogo had dreamed of the day when he might sack the great cities of the east. She glanced at her blood riders, their dark almond-shaped eyes giving no hint of their thoughts. Is it only the plunder they see? She wondered. How savage we must seem to these Carthaean. As you can see, she uses the word we, as she is simply self-conscious about how they're gonna be received in the city. And funnily enough, in A Storm of Swords, the Giscari referred to Dany as savage on behalf of her coming from Westeros. Tell her to look at the soldiers. Even the dim purple eyes of a sunset savage can see how magnificent my creatures are, surely. They prefer pigs and cows, your worship. Beef. Pfft! Food for unwashed savages. Tell the savage her secrets are safe with the Unsullied. She may set them to guard her councils and even her bedchamber, and never a worry as to what they may overhear. The Unsullied will learn your savage tongue quick enough, added Cras Desmona Claus, when all the arrangements had been made. It is good to see you know who I am, said Dany mildly. I pride myself on my knowledge of the savage senseless West. What is more, while Daenerys was born in Westeros, she does not have any memory of it, as she was exiled as a baby and was raised in Essos, thus making her Essosi. Valyrian, the lingua franca of Essos, is her mother tongue. She is ethnically Valyrian, just like the Lyseni and the Volantin, and following her marriage to Drogo, she is very much considered culturally Dothraki. Have you forgotten who you are? Look at you, look at you! Dany did not need to look. She was barefoot, with old hair, wearing Dothraki riding leathers and a painted vest given her as a bride gift. She looked as though she belonged here. The merchant must have taken her for Dothraki, with her clothes and her old hair and sun-browned skin. When she spoke, he gaped at her in astonishment. My lady, you are... Tyroshi, can it be so? My speech may be Tyroshi, and my garb Dothraki, but I am of Westeros, of the Sunset Kingdoms. She was garbed after the Carthaean fashion. Xaro had warned her that the enthroned would never listen to a Dothraki, so she had taken care to go before them in flowing green samite with one breast bared, silvered sandals on her feet, with a belt of black and white pearls about her waist. This is one of the many contradictions in her arc that make her into such a compelling character. Born to Westeros and raised in Essos, she belongs to both and neither at the same time. As an exile, she is transnational and stateless, but this contradiction, unfortunately, is flattened in the fandom perception. Some consider her a foreigner in Westeros, weaving theories of her army of eastern rapists coming to spoil the pure western white land, while others consider her a western colonizer imposing her will on the eastern people. The series has been analyzed from an imperial standpoint before, but almost always from a European perspective. However, Daenerys Targaryen and A Song of Ice and Fire espouse a form of imperialism unique to America, re-encoding ideas of American exceptionalism and benevolent imperialism. Numerous critics have analyzed the Orientalism and racism prominent in A Song of Ice and Fire. As Rainer Emmig points out, central characters in Westeros are all white and Caucasian. This white identity is personified by Daenerys, since her family line is specifically characterized by inbreeding. For centuries, the Targaryens had married brother to sister. The line must be kept pure. This inbreeding not only ensures the purity of their blood, it also retains the distinctive Targaryen appearance, pale-skinned, with lilac or indigo or violet eyes, and hair of silver gold or platinum white. It's true that almost all A Song of Ice and Fire characters are white. What puzzles me about this statement is the reasoning as to why Daenerys specifically is the personification of the white identity. 1. The practice of inbreeding went back to Valyria, which was an Eastern culture of the Eastern continent and was inspired by the ancient Egyptians. The Targaryens have heavily interbred, like the Ptolemies of Egypt. The Targaryens are distinctly different from every other Westerosi family. They're kings. They're practicing incest like the ancient Egyptians to try to keep the bloodline pure. 2. The practice of inbreeding was at no point exclusive to white people. 3. The practice of inbreeding was at no point exclusive to Targaryens. Starks too have a heavy preference towards marrying within the First Man ethnicity, to the point that a Stark woman's marriage to Ronel Arryn, who was an Andal, caused a scandal. That Torrhen Stark's daughter was wed to the young and ill-fated Lord of the Vale is well known. It was one of the many peace-binding marriages forged by Rhaenys. But there are letters preserved at the Citadel suggesting that Stark accepted these arrangements only after much protest, and that the bride's brothers refused to attend the wedding entirely. Similarly, cousin marriages are common in Westeros. Ned's parents were first cousins, as were Tywin and Johanna Lannister. 4. Targaryens frequently intermarried with Andal and First Man descending houses, more than any other house in Westeros in fact. Over the course of a 300-year-old dynasty, they married Hightowers, Arryns, Blackwoods and Danes, just to name a few examples. Not only that, the Targaryens thrice intermarried with the Dornish. The first Daenerys, daughter of Aegon the Unworthy and Naerys, married Maron Martell. Daeron II married Mireia Martell, which officially brought Dorne into the Seven Kingdoms, and Daenerys' own brother Rhaegar married Princess Elia Martell. Daenerys is a direct descendant of Mireia and Daeron. George R. R. Martin so said about the Dornish. And you also have the flavor given the culture by the Great Rhoynar influx led by Nymeria. I suppose the closest real-life equivalent to that would be the Moorish influence in parts of Spain. So you could say Dorne is Wales mixed with Spain and Palestine, with some entirely imaginary influences mixed in. Or you could just say it's Dorne. Medieval Spain, on which Dorne is based, had heavy Moorish presence and influence, and the Rhoynar seemed to be at least partially inspired by the Moors. And while it's true that the marriage between Mireia and Daeron happened a few generations back, in between those were two sibling marriages. Taking all this into account, Dany is actually half Blackwood, and her Dornish ancestry is pretty close. Her heritage is very much mixed. Later, Hartnett describes Orientalism in George's work and examines the examples. I agree with this part and have nothing to add. What I disagree with is this section. This Orientalization of Essos is also reinforced and solidified through Daenerys' attack and occupation of the cities of Slaver's Bay, conjuring imaginary of the White Savior. Several critics of A Song of Ice and Fire have likewise discussed or analyzed the blatant imperialism within the series. Valerie Estelle Frankel, in her book Women in Game of Thrones, comments that many fans compare Dany's adventures to colonialism. In such stories, the local way of life is usually depicted as savage and backwards, with the white ruler showing them a better way. Hardy expounds on this, saying, "The missionary role of Daenerys in defeating these cities, and their subsequent inability to transcend their entrenched culture, aligns well with Said's argument about implicit Western assumptions of superiority over the East. For Daenerys, dealing with the slave cities and their mulish inhabitants is a fantasy genre version of the white man's burden." Carroll also points this out, saying, Daenerys' choice to take down the slave trade carries many markers of the white savior trope of the white man's burden. The author promised to only delve into the show later, but she already conflates the show's singular unfortunate visual with the books. In A Song of Ice and Fire, Essosi slavery is class-based. The unsullied Dany encounters are of varied ethnicities, some are even Giscari. More than half had the copper skins and almond eyes of Dothraki and Lazarene. But she saw men of the free cities in the ranks as well, along with pale Carthin, ebon-faced Summer Islanders, and others whose origins she could not guess. And some had skins of the same amber hue as Krasn's Monaclos, and the bristly red-black hair that marked the ancient folk of Gis, who named themselves the Harpies' sons. They sell even their own kind. It should not have surprised her. The Dothraki did the same when Khalasar met Khalasar in the Sea of Grass. In response to the backlash to the scene in the show, Martin said, "Most of these people have obviously not read the books. If they had, they would know there is no racial component to slavery as practiced on Essos. It is based on slavery as it existed in the ancient world. The Romans and Greeks were just as willing to enslave other Greeks and Romans as they were Celts, Goths, Germans, and Africans. It's on the page. But just for the record, yes, Dany is white, just as she had been from the beginning, and she may or may not be a savior. The last scene in Misa is not the end of her journey by any means, but she frees slaves of all colors, races, creeds, and nationalities. The reason why it's so important to remember the non-racialized practice of slavery in this story is that ignoring it results in a certain pattern we will see in this essay and the general fandom. The focus on the destruction of the culture of the slaving gentry of the Bay versus the disregard to the pain of the slaves. In this instance, Hartnett likely assumed that the slaves of Slavers Bay are all of the same ethnicity as their masters, thus the culture she's uprooting is also theirs. But as established, people all over the world are enslaved in Astapor, and aside from the enslaved Giscari themselves, they do not share the culture of their masters, and if they do, they are forced into it. That's what I mean when I say that this essay is not immune to scrutiny because it was peer-reviewed. The author and the reviewers were influenced by outside factors, such as the show, and ignored this fact about the lore, even though the varied ethnicity of the Unsullied is one of the first things we learn about them. The same is true of Yunkish slaves. Misa, a brown-skinned man, shouted out at her. He had a child on his shoulder, a little girl, and she screamed the same word in her thin voice. Misa! Misa! Dany looked at Missandei. What are they shouting? It is Giscari, the old pure tongue. It means mother. Dany felt a lightness in her chest. I will never bear a living child, she remembered. Her hand trembled as she raised it. Perhaps she smiled. She must have, because the man grinned and shouted again, and others took up the cry. Misa, they called. Misa! Misa! They were all smiling at her, reaching for her, kneeling before her. Maela, some call her, while others cried Aelala, or Kate, or Tato. But whatever the tongue, it all meant the same thing. Mother. They are calling me mother. As you can see, the slaves Dany freed in Yunkai shout the word mother in their own languages, not just in the old Giscari tongue, which further gives credence to the fact that they are varied in terms of race, nationality, ethnicity, and culture. And even in the show, this visual was largely a matter of the fact that this scene was filmed in Morocco, and as such, it used Moroccan extras. At the same time, the show's slavery was also a matter of class in all other instances. Doria, Melisandre, Dario, Varys, Tyrion, and Jorah are all white, and yet all had been enslaved at some point. The persistent focus on the slaving gentry is ironic, considering that some people accuse George R.R. Martin of not giving the perspective of the freedmen and the slaves to Dany's campaign. While it's true that they do not have a POV character, whenever questioned on the matter, they overwhelmingly support Daenerys and her campaign. For example, the Unsullied aid Daenerys in her conquest, and so do other former slaves who organize themselves into militia, such as the Free Brothers led by Simon Stripeback. Thus, the former slaves are key figures in Dany's abolitionist campaign. Moreover, as Attewell argues in his essay, an authentic Giscari culture does not exist. The original culture was destroyed during the Sixth Giscari War. As we learn in A Storm of Swords, the gods of Gis were dead, and so too its people. These Astapori were mongrels, Ser Jorah said. Even the Giscari tongue was largely forgotten. The slave cities spoke the High Valyrian of their conquerors, or what they have made of it. The people are different, the language is different, and the religion is different, for all that the Graces pretend otherwise. Giscari culture as it exists in 300 AC was invented during the Century of Blood on different lines than what came before. What now remains of the once proud empire of Old Gis is a paltry thing. A few cities clinging like swords to Slavers Bay, and another that pretends to be Old Gis come again. For after the doom came to Valyria, the cities of Slavers Bay were able to throw off the last of the Valyrian shackles, rolling themselves in truth rather than playing at it. And what remained of the Giscari swiftly re-established their trade in slaves. The Astapori pretend that the Unsullied are the lockstep legions of the Old Empire come again, but those men were free, and the Unsullied are not. For all that the Giscari claim to be of the blood of Old Gis, and they do, repeatedly, Old Gis ruled an empire when the Valerians were still fucking sheep, and we are the sons of the Harpy. Ours is the blood of ancient Gis, whose empire was old when Valeria was yet a squalling child. This is an elaborate justification for human oppression and misery on an industrial scale, as Jim McGeehan has pointed out. We are no more bound to respect the claims of the good, wise and great masters than we are to believe that 16th century Italian classicists are really 1st century Romans reborn, and no more bound to respect their values than we would be to respect the claims of the supposed guttural virtues of the slave South. Fourth, and most importantly, 83% of the population of Slavers Bay, the slaves who give the region its name, are not part of this culture. The unfree majority of Astapor, Yunkai and meereen are an ethnically diverse lot. More than half had the copper skins and almond eyes of the dothraki and Lazarene, but she saw men of the free cities in their ranks as well, along with Pelkarthin, ebon-faced Samar Islanders, and others whose origins she could not guess, but who were almost certainly the Nati captives like Missandei and her brothers. These people did not choose or adapt Giscari culture. They were kidnapped by force and held in captivity by threat of death, and for the most part, they reject the culture of their masters. We can see this rejection in the many various ways that the freedmen of Slavers Bay used their agency to respond to the opportunity of Dany's arrival. Another important thing to note is that Daenerys cannot have a Western assumption of superiority over the East because she is from the East. She grew up in Essos, where slavery is a normal part of life. Her abolitionist values are neither uniquely Western nor a product of her feelings of superiority, but a product of her moral compass and her maturing outlook on life. Ironically, some Dany antis that I've encountered accused her of not developing anti-slavery stances soon enough. Later, Hartnett posits that Astapor and Slavers Bay in particular are meant to evoke the image of the Middle East. Astapor, one of the cities that Daenerys visits, located in the middle portion of the continent on the southern coast, is filled with imagery evocative of the Middle East. Daenerys remarks how so many Astapori women veiled their faces, and witnesses an elephant lamber passed with a lattice-work litter on its back. The veiled women and elephants immediately place the fictional Astapor as analogous to the real Middle East and South Asia. This does have textual evidence, so I will not argue against it. I will, however, offer additional inspiration for the Slavers Bay, the Roman Empire. This is especially evocative in the slaver garment known as the tokar. The garment was a clumsy thing. A long, loose, shapeless sheet that had to be wound around her hips and under an arm and over a shoulder, its dangling fringes carefully layered and displayed. Wound too loose, it was like to fall off. Wound too tight, it would tangle, trip, and bind. Even wound properly, the tokar required its wearer to hold it in place with the left hand. Walking in a tokar demanded small, mincing steps and exquisite balance, lest one tread upon these heavy, trailing fringes. It was not a garment meant for any man who had to work. The tokar was a master's garment, a sign of wealth and power. The Roman toga, one of the most recognizable garments from antiquity, had its roots in the earliest days of Rome, possibly as far back as the 6th century BCE. The circular design of the toga, which required substantial fabric and complex method of draping, distinguished it from the simpler clothing worn by many other cultures of the time. The complexity and the quality of fabric used made the toga an expensive item, serving as a status symbol even in its earliest incarnations. Not only are the words very similar, the style of wearing it is nearly identical. The Roman toga, too, was a status symbol. Only free citizens of Rome were allowed to wear it, much like only the masters can wear tokars. Attewell, too, points out that there's no singular definitive parallel to Slavers Bay. Describing Daenerys, he said, "It's much more like a classical Roman from 146 BC showed up and made war on descendants of the Carthaginians and Romans in 150 AD, and then picked a fight with a bunch of early medieval Italians." This reading is supported by George. I asked George about the Gis Valeria Rome-Greece thing. He said that there was no clear parallel, though elements of both are both in Gis and Valeria. In general, I would be against trying to settle for just one historical parallel for the nationalities and ethnicities of Planetos. The Giscari are such a contradictory mix that it makes my head spin. They are Rome, Carthage, Middle East and ancient Egypt at the same time. A Song of Ice and Fire is not historical fiction. It's a fantasy series with numerous different inspirations, and trying to fit its people into one neat box is reductive. Also, this is very minor, but Volantis, which is ethnically Valerian, also has elephants. They are a thing all around Essos. With such obvious real-life parallels, Westeros functioning as a double for England makes more analytical sense on a surface reading than considering it as a stand-in for the United States. The United States, historically, has been positioned against the empires of Britain, Nazi Germany, and the USSR. This not only belies the possibility of an imperial power, but it also hints at American exceptionalism, another aspect unique to American imperialism that will be discussed later. Just as the United States is presented as a non-imperial force in relation to European colonial powers, Daenerys is shown as non-imperial in that she is, in effect, distinct from previous forms of colonization. In Westeros' prehistory, Valyria was an ancient freehold, located on the southern pan of Essos, that had no kings, and all the citizenry who held land had a voice. This has led to many comparisons between Valyria and ancient Rome. Valyria expanded its authority and influence through conquest. After fighting 5 wars with a race called the Giscari, the Valyrians took the Giscari as slaves. The Giscari were the first to be thus enslaved, but not the last. The Valyrians continued to conquer lands further and further away from their freehold. As Valyria grew, its need for ore increased, which led to ever more conquests to keep the mines stocked with slaves. These conquests soon led to the domination of almost the entire continent of Essos, just as Rome colonized Gaul, the district west of the Black Sea, northern Africa, the islands of the Mediterranean, and even Britain, in their attempts to control the world. This is significant because slavery is the impetus that launches Daenerys' conquest, since she focuses specifically on the cities in Slaver's Bay. By displacing slavery and colonization onto Valyria, and by extension Essos, Martin is clearly drawing a distinction between Westeros and Essos. This is further supported by the fact that the Westerosi have long since abandoned the practice of slavery, as Sir Barristan, a knight sworn to Daenerys' service, tells her. There have been no slaves in the Seven Kingdoms for thousands of years. Furthermore, by having Daenerys travel through Essos undoing slavery, Martin shows that Daenerys is a new imperial power, distinct from those in the past. For that reason, it makes more sense to read Daenerys as the United States Empire because, as Kaplan argues, United States continental expansion is often treated as an entirely separate phenomenon from European colonialism of the 19th century, rather than as an interrelated form of imperial expansion. Daenerys' colonization of Essos is distinct from that of the Valyrians. Just like the United States, she is presented as a new imperial power, separate from the older, destructive imperial forces. If Daenerys has any connection to the previous history of imperialism within Westeros, then it is only through her attempt to correct the evils it led staining the landscape of Essos, cloaking her actions with the veil of exceptionalism. Although the series doesn't shy away from calling her a conqueror, Daenerys' point of view chapters are rife with attempted justification for her actions. In all 3 cities that she conquers, she frees slaves. She sees herself as a liberator, or as her herald proclaims her, a breaker of shackles. This is a perfect example of the exceptionalism often ascribed to the United States. As Julian Go argues, exceptionalism doesn't deny empire. Rather, imperialists fashion their empire distinct. The United States would be an empire, but unlike other empires, it would use its power benevolently, taking up the task of transforming, uplifting, and democratizing foreign people. This exceptionalism is also reinforced by the distinction of US imperial policies from the rest of the world. While European empires were tyrannical and exploitative, American empire has been beneficial and selfless. While European empires suppressed liberty, rights and democracy, America's empire has been aimed at spreading them. Likewise, Daenerys is presented as a benevolent conqueror throughout the series. Her main driving force is to free the slaves of Essos. As she heads to Meereen with her massive army, she finds her path marked with horrifying sights. Due to her freeing of slaves in the cities of Astapor and Yunkai, at each of the 163 mileposts leading to the city of Meereen, the slave masters have nailed a slave child. Daenerys is shocked and appalled and demands to look at all the children, saying, "I will see everyone and count them and look upon their faces, and I will remember." In this passage, Martin presents Daenerys as sympathetic to the reader. Her refusal to ignore the deaths of the slave children marks her as a kind person. Her determination to view every child killed also endears her to the audience, since, especially in fantasy literature, steadfastness and resolve are marks of a strong leader. Moreover, her sadness and anger at the cruel and pointless murder of the innocent slave children illustrates Martin's attempt to show Daenerys as altruistic and selfless. The first thing that warrants mention here is that while the Valyrians did war with Old Geese and enslave its people, there's an obfuscation of one crucial fact. Old Geese had been a colonial empire in its own right centuries before the rise of Valyria, reigning supreme over much of Essos, and that the Valyrians learned one deplorable thing from the Giscari, slavery. The Giscari whom they conquered were the first to be thus enslaved, but not the last. Notice something curious. Hartnett referenced that very passage from the World Book, but omitted the sentence directly preceding it. Why she did that remains a mystery, though I have my suspicions. Secondly, the author positions that Daenerys is colonizing Essos with no explanation as to what led her to believe that. In fact, colonialism is not defined in this essay at all, because if it was, the assumption that Daenerys is colonizing would have to be thrown out of the window. The author seemingly believes that it's enough for Daenerys to be called a conqueror in the text for her to be a colonizer, but not all conquest is colonial. The conquest of Britain by William the Conqueror certainly wasn't, and colonialism is, first and foremost, an economic institution. In our world, colonial entities such as the British Empire engaged in conquest and war with the specific intent of the plunder of resources for the benefit of their empires, engaging in exploitation of the lands and people they subjugated. Much the same can be said of the in-universe colonial empires, such as Valyria and Olgies. These crucial aspects of colonialism are lacking from Daenerys' conquest of Slaver's Bay. Her conquest is not done on behalf of Westeros, as it does not materially benefit it in any way, shape or form. The Westerosi barely know what Dany is up to. In fact, Dany's campaign actively hinders her effort of reclaiming Westeros. She could have well sacked the 3 cities and moved west without sparing a thought as to what happens later, but she chooses to stay and continue the abolitionist campaign well into A Dance with Dragons, even when she has numerous opportunities to abandon meereen to its fate. Once we realize that Daenerys does not have an empire on behalf of which she is colonizing, we must necessarily presuppose that she, a singular teenager, is a colonial empire in her own right. History does not lack for very young people who led armies. For instance, Alexander the Great was Dany's age when he first led armies into combat. But this was done on behalf of Macedonia. The crucial distinction between them is that there's no entity on behalf of which Dany is colonizing, as she is an exile with no home. Unless, again, you believe that a singular teenager can be a colonial empire. And given how this fandom moves, it really wouldn't surprise me if someone did claim precisely that. Not only is there no empire, Daenerys does not engage in conquest for the purpose of colonial exploitation, and even if she wanted to, she couldn't, because the only real resource these city-states had were slaves, and she put an end to that. This constitutes much of the problem of her tenure in Meereen. Prior to her advance, the slavers harvested everything they could and burned everything else, so the agriculture is stalling, and there's no precious materials or other resources she could exploit. In essence, they have nothing to export, and therefore, Dany has nothing she could extract out of Slaver's Bay at the benefit of any empire, or herself if we assume that she, a singular teenager, is a colonial empire. But one may of course say that Daenerys only used her campaign as a pretext to conquer Slaver's Bay, much like the US manufactures consent for imperialism under the guise of benevolence. For instance, how the pretext for the invasion of Iraq was to stop Saddam Hussein, who allegedly had weapons of mass destruction. This worked as intended, as at the time, the majority of Americans supported the war. Iraq was one of 3 countries, along with Iran and North Korea, that constituted an axis of evil, according to Bush. But Iraq drew much more attention from the former president than did those countries. This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world, Bush said. Even before his speech, Americans were inclined to believe the worst about Hussein's regime. In a survey conducted a few weeks prior to the State of the Union, 73% favored military action in Iraq to end Hussein's rule. Just 16% were opposed. More than half, 56%, said the US should take action against Iraq, even if it meant US forces might suffer thousands of casualties. At that point, more than a year before the United States went to war, Americans overwhelmingly embraced several possible rationales for military action. 83% said that if the US learned that Iraq had aided the 9/11 terrorists, that would be a very important reason to use military force in Iraq. Nearly as many said the same if it was shown that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction, 77%, or harboring other terrorists, 75%. Over the next several months, Bush and other senior officials claimed with varying degrees of certainty that there was evidence justifying the use of US military force. In a speech to a Veterans of Foreign Wars convention in August 2002, former Vice President Dick Cheney was unequivocal in asserting, simply stated, there is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us. I find this especially crucial even outside of the context of this video, because many Americans like to pretend that they were against the invasion. Stop lying. You were on board. In hindsight, we know that the weapons of mass destruction claim was a hoax used to justify the plunder of Iraq's resources. The crucial difference here, slavery is real, and Daenerys does not use its existence as a pretext to exploit Slaver's Bay. If that were the case, she would simply plunder these cities and then go west. As already established, she does not stay to extract resources, as there is no entity on behalf of which she could do that. She never intended to do that. She never did that. And there's literally nothing to exploit. I also want to ask, what should she have done instead? Leave Astapor to its ways? If that happened, she would be accused of being cavalier to slavery. Buy the Unsullied, then she would be called a slaver. Buy Unsullied, sack Astapor, and move west. Then she would indeed be exploiting the city to her benefit. In essence, she is damned if she does, and damned if she doesn't. And you know what? It's about time someone said it. The base cities prior to Daenerys' arrival were colonial polities. Firstly, they explicitly considered themselves the spiritual successors of the colonial Old Empire of Giz. Secondly, they engaged in mass economic exploitation of the Essosi citizens. Astapor, for instance, engages in mass kidnapping of male children to make them unsullied in a notoriously brutal training that involves their castration and dehumanization. Only a third survived that training. Yunkai engages in mass kidnappings of children to make them into sex slaves, which is institutionalized child sexual exploitation. From that exploitation, they profit handsomely. Their slaves are their colonial subjects. Daenerys' abolitionist campaign is as much a fight against slavery as it is an anti-colonial uprising. In fact, this lack of economic exploitation is what differentiates Dany from Valyria. The Valyrians exploited the lands and people they subjugated and implanted settlers, enriching themselves in the process, while Daenerys didn't. And, most crucially, Daenerys fights against the legacy of the colonial empire of her ancestors. This becomes all that more apparent once Volantis enters the war. Volantis, the mightiest of the Free Cities, quickly laid claim to Valyria's mantle. Men and women of noble Valyrian blood, though not dragon lords, called for war upon the other cities. Daenerys fights against that legacy, and yet she is accused of perpetuating it. It's difficult to combat this talking point because nobody wants to be called an apologist for colonialism, and many people do not have a full grasp on what colonialism actually is. And it's first and foremost an economic reality. Everything else is its byproduct. Colonialism isn't just conquest. Colonialism isn't a blonde teenager doing conquest. It's a policy of brutal economic exploitation done on the behalf of an empire. This reading is so prevalent because this is the only optics-friendly way to condemn Daenerys and her abolitionist campaign as morally wrong. Daenerys also views herself as altruistic, once asking herself, why do the gods make kings and queens if not to protect the ones who can't protect themselves? While this idea is paternalistic, because she believes she is the only one capable of helping and protecting people who cannot save themselves, it also illustrates how she views all her actions as entirely benevolent. She has come to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Likewise, she actively works at assimilating the Meereenese because she believes it to be in their best interest. She has the head of her Queen's Guard, Sir Barristan Selmy, begin training knights for her, teaching the sons of slaves to fight with lance and longsword in the Westerosi fashion. Daenerys does not work to assimilate the Meereenese into the Westerosi ways. The opposite happens. She assimilates into the Meereenese ways by wearing their garments, getting married in their rights, seeking advice from their representatives. The boys Barristan trains are former slaves and not exclusively Meereenese. Some of them had been training for the fighting pits when Daenerys Targaryen took Meereen and freed them from their chains. Those had a good acquaintance with sword and spear and battle axe even before Sir Barristan got hold of them. A few might well be ready. The boy from the Basilic Isles, for a start, Tum Kolo. Black as Maester's ink he was, but fast and strong. The best natural swordsman Selmy had seen since Jaime Lannister. Larak as well, the Lash. Sir Barristan did not approve of his fighting style, but there was no doubting his skills. Larak had years of work ahead of him before he mastered proper knightly weapons, sword and lance and mace, but he was deadly with his whip and trident. The old knight had warned him that the whip would be useless against an armored foe, until he saw how Larak used it, snapping it around the legs of his opponents to yank them off their feet. No knight as yet, but a fierce fighter. Larak and Tumko were his best. After them the Lazarine, the one the other boys called Red Lamb. But as yet, that one was all ferocity and no technique. Perhaps the brothers too. 3 low-born Giscari, enslaved to pay their father's debts. All of them are freed slaves who were in Meereen when Dany came, not members of the Giscari elite. In fact, the 3 Giscari Baristan trains are low-born. It's the same as the Unsullied because the Giscari enslave everyone, including their own, and slavery is a matter of class. Yet another important thing that happens is that Daenerys makes a conscious effort to be at the same level as her people. There had been a throne there, a fantastic thing of carved and gilded wood in the shape of a savage harpy. She had taken one long look and commanded it be broken up for firewood. "I will not sit in the harpy's lap," she told them. Instead she sat upon a simple ebony bench. It served, though she had heard the Meereenese muttering that it did not befit a queen. On the A Dance with Dragons cover, I put Daenerys at the top of the stairs of the Meereenese pyramid. George told me that Daenerys wants equality for everyone. She wants to be at the same level as her people, so I had her climb down to keep it consistent. That does not strike me as the behavior of a paternalistic colonizer. More importantly, she begins training Meereenese children as messengers, teaching them the Westerosi language. As Renata Constantino states, the molding of men's minds is the best means of conquest. Education, therefore, serves as a weapon in wars of colonial conquest. Constantino elaborates on the way in which education was transported by the United States to the Philippines as a means of imperialism and control, saying, "The education of the Filipino under American sovereignty was an instrument of colonial policy. The Filipino had to be educated as a good colonial. Young minds had to be shaped to conform to American ideas. Just as the Americans used education to assert control, Daenerys is selecting young, impressionable Meereenese to educate as well. Furthermore, by teaching them the common tongue of Westeros, she is also removing them from their own language. These actions echo American educational policies in Puerto Rico and the Philippines, as well as assimilationist policies employed against the indigenous North American population. Nevertheless, the decision to train Meereenese in the Westerosi fighting styles and to educate Meereenese children in the Westerosi language are both indicative of a ruler who believes she is altruistic, but is simultaneously fulfilling basic tenets of imperialistic policy. While it's true that Dany takes child hostages, she does not do so to isolate them from their language and culture, but to stop the killings of the Sons of the Harpy. And the part about her teaching them the common tongue is a fabrication. Nothing of the sort happens. In fact, Dany specifically mentions that she speaks the common tongue only with Ser Barristan. "As you wish. Bring your frog to court tomorrow. The others too. The Westerosi. It would be nice to hear the common tongue from someone besides Ser Barristan." At court, Daenerys speaks Giscari. "They call him Frog," she said. "And we have just learned why. In the Seven Kingdoms, there are children's tales of frogs who turn into enchanted princes when kissed by their true love." Smiling at the Dornish knights, she switched back to the common tongue. She only ever mentions Ser Barristan teaching the boys about Western chivalry once. That is no language, and is not done with a specific purpose of isolating them from the Meereenese culture. I always thought that this is just a way to keep them occupied, as they are kids who need to have something to do. The author believes this to be one of the basic tenets of imperialistic policy, and not only does it not happen, at no point does she mention another basic tenet of imperialistic policy, the economic exploitation, something that Daenerys never does, which disputes this entire reading altogether. But let's continue. Daenerys' interpretation of her actions as benevolent is not surprising. What is surprising, however, is that many critics of the series also view her as a compassionate conqueror. Frankel states that, by intervening in Slaver's Bay, Daenerys has proclaimed them free, and they could not have freed themselves without her help. Now she has come to be their messiah and teach them her superior ways. In fact, Frankel disputes other critics who argue against the questionable racial politics of Daenerys' anti-slavery mission, saying, "The slaves of the books are mixed, people of the Dothraki and Free Cities, and even the race of the Giscari slave owners, as well as the dark-skinned Samar Isles. The image thus isn't so color-coded." While Frankel's cited claim that she teaches them her superior ways is a bit puzzling, she is otherwise 100% correct in asserting that Dany's campaign is not that of a white savior. As already established, the slaves in Essos vary in ethnicity. Many ethnicities sell their own people, not just the Giscari and the Dothraki. The White Lyseni also enslave their own. One has to look no further than at the situation of the noble Rogar family, whose fall from grace saw them enslaved. In fact, on the basis of Lys being mostly known for its pleasure houses, the White Valyrian Lyseni are probably the most sexually trafficked ethnicity in Planetos. In his article, The Ethical Movement of Daenerys Targaryen, Christopher Roman contends that Daenerys is unique within the series in that she is the only leader who can wield an ethical politics that questions the political action of the bloodlusting men of Westeros. He views Daenerys' conquest of Slaver's Bay and her act of freeing the slaves to mean that she is forging a space for the victim to speak and that she is ultimately committed to the other, the victims, the slaves, the women, the dragons, the dead. Despite her obvious conquest of these cities with a foreign army and the naming of herself as queen, Roman never places her in the position of conqueror or dictator. In fact, he specifically claims that she stands in opposition to these types of leaders, saying that she must work on ethical solutions on a situational level because otherwise she is merely playing politics with oppressors. Daenerys is a foreign ruler, using a foreign army to conquer cities that she has no valid right to rule. She takes these cities through violence, forces them to abandon aspects of their tradition and history, and enforces Western, or Westerosi, ideas of morality onto them. Every aspect of her conquest through Essos is that of an oppressor. Therefore, the only reason that critics assert she is not an oppressor or tyrant is because they view her colonization as benevolent. The first question I have is about the alleged foreign army. The only army Dany has at that point are the Unsullied. Either they are part of the Giscari culture she colonized, or they are a foreign army. They can't be both. Secondly, the taking of Meereen had an additional reason. If they don't do that, the freedmen will starve to death. Dany set great store by Ser Jorah's counsel, but to leave Meereen untouched was more than she could stomach. She could not forget the children on their posts. The birds tearing at their entrails, their skinny arms pointing up the coast road. Ser Jorah, you say we have no food left. If I march west, how can I feed my freedmen? You can't. I am sorry, Khaleesi. They must feed themselves or starve. Many and more will die along the march, yes. That will be hard, but there is no way to save them. We need to put this scorched earth well behind us. Dany had left a trail of corpses behind her when she crossed the Red Waste. It was a sight she never meant to see again. No, she said. I will not march my people off to die. My children. There must be some way into this city. Roman is right in the assertion that the slaves of Essos overwhelmingly see Daenerys as a liberator. This arrogant child has taken it upon herself to smash the slave trade, but that traffic was never confined to Slaver's Bay. It was part of the sea of trade that spanned the world, and the Dragon Queen has clouded the water. Behind the Black Wall, lords of ancient blood sleep poorly, listening as their kitchen slaves sharpen their long knives. Slaves grow our food, clean our streets, teach our young. They guard our walls, row our galleys, fight our battles. And now when they look east, they see this young queen shining from afar, this breaker of chains. The old blood cannot suffer that. Poor men hate her too. Even the vilest beggar stands higher than a slave. This dragon queen will rob him of that consolation. The Volantine red priests preach in favor of Daenerys and are intently listened to by many slaves. Tyrion crossed his arms and looked behind him, studying the faces of the men and women who had stopped to listen. Everywhere he turned, he saw tattoos. Slaves. 4 of every 5 of them are slaves. The priest is calling on the Volantines to go to war, the half-maester told him. But on the side of right, as soldiers of the Lord of Light, Rolor who made the sun and stars, and fights eternally against the darkness. Niesos and Malako have turned away from the light, he says, their hearts darkened by the yellow harpies from the east. He says, dragons. I understood that word. He said dragons. Aye, the dragons have come to carry her to glory. Her, Daenerys? Haldon nodded. Benero has sent forth the word from Volantis. Her coming is the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy. From smoke and salt was she born to make the world anew. She is Azor Ahai returned, and her triumph over darkness will bring a summer that will never end. Death itself will bend its knee, and all those who die fighting in her cause shall be reborn. Attewell also points out the various ways in which the slaves of Essos exercise their newfound independence. Other Astapori freedmen joined Dany in forming a new, more representative government. Dany had left Astapor in the hands of a council of former slaves, led by a healer, a scholar, and a priest. Wise men all, she thought, and just. Still others decide to flee Astapor and follow in the footsteps of Dany's army. Also a phenomenon experienced by General Grant in his Mississippi River Valley campaign and by General Sherman in his march to the sea. Tens of thousands preferred to follow her to Yunkai, rather than remain behind in Astapor. I told them they were free. I cannot tell them now they are not free to join me. And still others plan to overthrow that new government and establish their own, contrasting vision of what a new Astapor should look like. The point is, it's hardly the case that the slaves of Astapor are passive observers, lacking agency. It's important here to note the diversity of agency exercised by freedmen in Meereen. Some seek justice in the courts, others pursue economic independence, be it by weaving or by prostitution. Many join in Dany's revolution by joining the Brazen Beasts, Free Brothers, Stalwart Shields, and Mother's Men. Those who long for a return to slavery are a class apart from the field hands or urban laborers, akin to the sometimes different reactions between house slaves and field hands, although historians argue that's been somewhat exaggerated. As already mentioned, the freedmen are present and active in Dany's council in ways that they've never been before, and in contrast to other leaders in the story who do not have common-born people in such representative roles. The only other one I can think of is Jaehaerys I, who had a commoner Septon Barth as a hand. Molono Yozdob, Taltorak, Simon Strideback, Marcellan, Belvas, Grey Worm, Missandei, and Rilona Rhee are all former slaves that advised Dany at various points of the story. Dany is even unique in the fact that women have an active voice and active seats in her councils. Yet Hartnett only ever acknowledges the point of view of the slave-owning gentry and only ever ascribes victimhood to them. She does not spare a word of the oppression they inflict on their slaves. And, once more, she fails to address how she even defines colonialism, as Dany's actions in Slaver's Bay do not meet any coherent definition of thereof. To reiterate points made previously, Daenerys is not enforcing Westerosi or Western ideas on the Giscari, as she was not even raised in Westeros. She was raised in Essos, where slavery was widespread and normalized. Her abolitionist stance comes from her own moral compass, not nebulous Westerosi values. As I mentioned previously, it's very hard to combat the accusation of Daenerys being a colonizer, because the immediate response to that is gonna be, oh, so you support her colonial policy. I bet you love colonialism. Even the academics of the opposing view to Hartnett, such as Christopher Roman, are not spared from that accusation. To hear that would probably be daunting to a seasoned academic such as him, let alone someone who does not have such credentials behind their belt and is just a regular fan. According to Hartnett, the only reason why someone might view Dany's actions as wholly benevolent is because they are too ignorant to see Daenerys as a colonizer, which she positions as a fact rather than an opinion she failed to substantiate, and not because, ending slavery is based. Honestly, from my humble point of view, Romance is a better grasp on what is happening in this story, and his reading certainly has more basis on the text than Hartnett's dubious claims of colonialism. Despite the claims of altruism, the true purpose of Daenerys' conquest of Essos is her desire for power and the throne of Westeros. This claim would be true if Daenerys went to Astapor, sacked it, and went to Westeros with her newfound army. What she does instead is march to Yunkai and then Meereen with the purpose of freeing its slaves. Following Astapor falling into chaos and Yunkai re-enslaving everyone, she stays in Meereen to avoid it having the same fate. This explicitly goes against her long-term goals of reclaiming Westeros. "There is nothing to stay for," said Brown Ben Plum. "Your Grace, the slavers brought their doom on themselves," said Dariona Harris. "You have brought freedom as well," Missandei pointed out. "Freedom to starve?" asked Dany sharply. "Freedom to die? Am I a dragon or a harpy? Am I mad? Do I have detained?" "A dragon," Ser Barristan said with certainty. "Meereen is not Westeros, Your Grace. But how can I rule 7 kingdoms if I cannot rule a single city?" He had no answer to that. Then he turned away from them, to gaze out over the city once again. "My children need time to heal and learn. My dragons need time to grow and test their wings. And I need the same. I will not let this city go the way of Astapor. I will not let the Harpy of Yunkai chain up those I freed all over again." She turned back to look at their faces. "I will not march." "What will you do then, Khaleesi?" asked Percaro. "Stay," she said. "Rule. And be a queen." Throughout the Dance with Dragons, Daenerys is urged to abandon Meereen and focus on Westeros. When Xarok Zoan Daxos comes from Karth and offers her ships to sail to Westeros, Dany refuses to go. Those left behind in Meereen would envy them their easy deaths, moaned Resnack. They will make slaves of us, or throw us in the pits. All will be as it was, or worse. Where is your courage? Sir Barristan lashed out. Her Grace freed you from your chains. It is for you to sharpen your swords and defend your own freedom when she leaves. Brave words from one who means to sail into the sunset. Simon Strideback snared back. Will you look back at our dying? Your Grace, magnificence, your worship, enough! Danny slapped the table. No one will be left to die. You are all my people. Her dreams of home and love had blinded her. I will not abandon Meereen to the fate of Astapor. It grieves me to say so, but Westeros must wait. Groleo was aghast. We must accept these ships. If we refuse this gift, Sir Barristan went to one knee before her. My queen, your realm has need of you. You are not wanted here, but in Westeros, men will flock to your banners by the thousands, great lords and noble knights. She is come, they will shout to one another, in glad voices. Prince Rhaegar's sister has come home at last. If they love me so much, they will wait for me. A similar temptation comes when the Dornish men arrive at her court. It is a secret pact, Danny said, made in Braavos when I was just a little girl. Sir Willem Darry signed for us, the man who spirited my brother and myself away from Dragonstone, before the usurper's men could take us. Prince Oberyn Martell signed for Dorne, with the Sea Lord of Braavos as witness. She handed the parchment to Sir Barristan, so he might read it for himself. The alliance is to be sealed by marriage, it says. In return for Dorne's help overthrowing the usurper, my brother Viserys is to take Prince Doran's daughter Arianne for his queen. You mean to marry me? Is that the way of it? The gift you bring me is your own sweet self. Instead of Viserys and your sister, you and I must seal this pact if I want Dorne. Dorne is 50,000 spears and swords, pledged to our queen's service. She turned to the Dornishman. Would that you had come a year ago. I am pledged to wed the noble Hisdar Zolorak. Christopher Roman agrees with me. For Daenerys, her ethical choice of freeing the people and her political desire to return to Westeros to reclaim the Iron Throne represents what medievalist M.V. Dougherty outlines as a common moral debate in medieval moral theory. An agent discovers equally compelling moral reasons to perform and to desist from an action, and these compelling reasons cannot be voided. On the one hand, Daenerys is compelled to return to Westeros because of a sense of reclaiming what is her right. Not to do so would betray her family's history. On the other hand, in the process of building an army for such a purpose, she frees the slaves from unjust treatment. Not to free them would violate her sense of justice. The slaves then become part of her governmental structure. In continually seeking the liberation of unjustly treated peoples, her return to Westeros seems less and less likely. After the death of her brother, she decides that the Iron Throne is rightfully hers. Once she decides this, her conquest of Essos begins. She uses her whiteness to gain power, amass an army, and conquer. The first power she gains is through her forced marriage to Khal Drogo. She is chosen to marry this powerful Dothraki king because of her fair complexion and Valyrian heritage. When her brother expresses doubt that Drogo will be interested in her due to her young age, his benefactor responds, "She has had her blood. She is old enough for the Khal. Look at her. That silver gold hair, those purple eyes. She is the blood of old Valyria, no doubt, and highborn, daughter of the old king, sister to the new. She cannot fail to entrance our Drogo." She is selected to marry Drogo because of her whiteness, either due to her exotic appearance in comparison to the darker population of Essos, or because of her Valyrian, read white, blood. This power awarded due to her race becomes the first power she truly holds, as the Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea. At the beginning, Hartnett correctly points out that A Song of Ice and Fire is a series with predominantly white protagonists. Yet once again, she singles out those of Valyrian ethnicity as the true embodiment of whiteness. Curiously, the passage she references does not speak of the fairness of Dany's skin, only of her eyes and hair, and yet she still claims that Dany's power comes from her whiteness, because it's her whiteness that made Drogo choose to marry her. Thus, said whiteness allowed her to access power. In case you forget, Hartnett here talks about a 13-year-old being sold into slavery, but even if you don't see it as a matter of enslavement, I need to say a few words about Valyrians. Valyrians used to dominate Essos with their dragons until the Doom, which wiped out their entire civilization and all the Dragonlord families aside from Targaryens, but it did not wipe out the Valyrians, who are one of the many ethnicities inhabiting Essos. The leaders of Volantis, which claimed Valyria's spiritual mantle, descend from the non-dragon-riding noble families of Valyria, Lys, another Valyrian settlement, is known for the fact that even its small folk have Valyrian features. As mentioned, the Lyseni are disproportionately affected by sex trafficking. The way Daenerys is described in that passage, especially in the context of the fact that she's being sold, does not really have marks of power. It has marks of something that borders on ethnic fetishization. Dany is, in that scene, reduced to a sexual, fetishized object, and fetishization isn't about desire or power, but about subjugation. It is a bit similar to the fetishization faced by Slavic women, especially following the fall of the Soviet Union, when Eastern European and especially Slavic women were disproportionately affected by sex trafficking. During the Cold War, the image of a Slavic woman was not sexualized at all. It was a strong working woman from those banger propaganda posters. After the fall of the USSR, Slavic women became sexy bombshells, Slavic dolls. The topic of this strange place Slavic women occupy is fascinating and rarely explored, as in spite of the fact that most Slavs are white, the treatment of Slavic women is similar to the fetishization of East Asian women, as both are assumed to be inherently more traditional and submissive than Western European or American women. This fetishization of the Valyrians and how that resembles the fetishization of Slavs is something I hadn't considered until it was pointed out by my friend. And ironically, I am Slavic and she is Romani. Regardless of if you agree with this reading, I once again need to stress that Dany's Valyrian ethnicity is a source of objectification, not power. This is additionally reinforced by Doria, a Lyseni slave that Dany receives as a wedding gift. Iri and Jiki were copper-skinned dothraki with black hair and almond-shaped eyes, Doria a fair-haired, blue-eyed Lysin girl. Remember, the Lyseni are ethnic Valyrians, which makes Dany and Doria share the same ethnicity and similar looks, yet neither of them are treated any better or are granted any protection within the Khalasar on behalf of their whiteness. In some Khalasars, Jiki said, the Blood Riders share the khal's wine, his tent, and even his wives, though never his horses. A man's mouth was his own. Daenerys was glad that Khal Drogo did not hold to those ancient ways. She should not have liked being shared. And while old Koholo treated her kindly enough, the others frightened her. Hago, huge and silent, often glowered as if he had forgotten who she was, and Koto had cruel eyes and quick hands that liked to hurt. He left bruises on Doria's soft white skin whenever he touched her, and sometimes made Iri sob in the night. As you can see, both the Lyseni Doria and the Dothraki Iri are assaulted by Koto, and the only reason Dany is not shared among the Blood Riders is because Drogo had so decided. At no point is it implied that her whiteness was a factor. The white Lyseni Doria isn't given any special treatment in the Khalasar either. I don't expect Hartnett to know all the interviews with Martin, yet I feel the need to mention one curious thing. Martin wishes he made the Valyrians black. Right from the start I wanted the Targaryens, and by extension the Valyrians, from whom they were descended, to be a race apart, with distinctive features that set them apart from the rest of Westeros, and help explain their obsession with the purity of their blood. To do this, I made a conventional high fantasy choice, and gave them silver gold hair, purple and violet eyes, fine chiseled aristocratic features. That worked well enough, at least in the books, on the show less so, but in recent years it has occurred to me from time to time that it might have made for an interesting twist if instead I had made the Dragon Lords of Valyria, and therefore the Targaryens, black. Maybe I could have kept the silver hair too, though. No, that comes too close to Dark Elf territory, but still. If I'd had dark-skinned Dragon Lords invade and conquered, and dominate a largely white Westeros, that choice would have brought its own perils. The Targaryens have not all been heroic, after all. Some of them have been monsters, madmen, so, well, it's all moot. The idea came to me about 20 years too late. There existed Black Valyrians too. Belager Otherys, the Black Pearl of Braavos, was one of Aegon the Unworthy's mistresses and had 3 children with him, Belenora, Narha, and Balerion. What is even more relevant here is that Hartnett claims that Daenerys' whiteness differentiates from the darker population of Essos. Again, this does not really make sense, especially when we put this scene in context. The purchase of Daenerys happens in the free city of Pentos, which by itself has Valyrian and Andal roots. Founded by Valyrians as a trading outpost, Pentos soon absorbed the hinterlands surrounding it, from the Velvet Hills and the Little Rhoyne to the sea, including almost the whole of the ancient realm of Andalos, the original homeland of the Andals. The first Pentoshi were merchants, traders, seafarers, and farmers, with few of high birth amongst them. Perhaps for this reason, they were less protective of their Valyrian blood and more willing to breed with the original inhabitants of the lands they ruled. As a consequence, there is considerable Andal blood amongst the men of Pentos, making them perhaps our closest cousins. And here perhaps is a good moment to note one crucial thing. The people of Planetos do not have the same perception of race as we do, because the process of forming race and racism didn't happen there in the way it happened in our world. The modern concept of race is a product of the colonial enterprises of European powers from the 16th to 18th centuries that identified race in terms of skin color and physical difference. While the practice of colonialism predates the modern definitions of race, modern racism stems from the need to find justifications for the enslavement of Africans and other races in the post-medieval era of European colonial expansion, an enterprise that does not have a precedent in Planetos. However, what is alive and well in Planetos is xenophobia, which is a prejudice along ethnic or national lines, and the white Valyrians are not spared from that. When the noble Rogar family arrived at Westeros, they were treated with extreme hostility. Lara Rogar had taken up residence in the Red Keep with her husband, yet in her heart she remained a lady of Lys. Though fluent in High Valyrian and the dialects of Myr, Tyrosh and Old Volantis, in addition to her own Lysian tongue, Lady Lara made no effort to learn the common tongue, preferring to rely upon translators to make her wishes known. Her ladies were all Lyseni, as were her servants. The gowns she wore all came from Lys, even her small clothes. Her father's ships delivered the latest Lysian fashions to her thrice a year. All this the court and kingdom might have come to accept in time, had Lady Lara not also insisted upon keeping her own gods. She would have no part in the worship of the Seven, nor the old gods of the Northmen. Her worship was reserved for certain of the manifold gods of Lys, the six-breasted cat goddess Panthera, Indros of the Twilight, who was male by day and female by night, the pale child Bacalon of the Sword, faceless Sagael, the giver of pain. Her ladies, her servants, and her guards would join Lady Lara at certain times in performing obeisance to these queer, ancient deities. Cats were seen coming and going from her chambers so often that men began to say they were her spies, pouring at her in soft voices of all the doings of the Red Keep. It was even said that Lara herself could transform into a cat to prowl the gutters and rooftops of the city. Darker rumors soon arose. The acolytes of Indros could supposedly transform themselves from male to female and female to male through the act of love, and whispers went about that her ladyship oft availed herself of this ability at twilight orgies, so she might visit the brothels of the Street of Silk as a man. And every time a child went missing, the ignorant would look at one another and talk of Sagael's insatiable thirst for blood. The last sentence in particular reminds me of blood libel, an anti-Semitic canard according to which Jews would kidnap Christians, particularly Christian children, to perform rituals on them. But there's more. Their pride and pomp and power became the talk of King's Landing. Men began to whisper of their wiles. Loto bought men with gold, Rogerio seduced them with perfumed flesh, Moredo frightened them into submission with steel. Yet the brothers were no more than puppets in the hands of Lady Lara. It was her and her queer Lysian gods who held their strings. The king, the little queen, the young prince. They were only children, blind to what was happening about them. Willis the king's guard and the gold cloaks and even the king's hand had been bought and sold. Or so the stories went. Like all such tales, they had some truth to them, well mixed with fear and falsehood. That the Lyseni were proud, grasping and ambitious cannot be doubted. That Loto used his bank and Rogerio his brother to win friends to their cause goes without saying. Yet in the end, they differed but little from many of the other lords and ladies of Aegon III's court, all of them pursuing power and wealth in their own ways. Though more successful than their rivals, for a time at least, the Lyseni were only one of several factions competing for influence. Had Lady Lara and her brothers been Westerosi, they might have been admired and celebrated, but their foreign birth, foreign ways, and foreign gods made them objects of mistrust and suspicion instead. Similar sentiments were expressed about Regodras, who was Jaehaerys I's Pentoshi master of coin. When his lordship raised his hands to ward off the blows raining down on him, golden gemstones glittered on every finger, and the attack grew more frenzied still. A woman shouted, "He's Pentoshi! Them's the bastards bring the shivers here." One of the men pried a stone up from the king's newly cobbled street and brought it down upon Lord Rhaego's head again and again, until only a red mash of blood and bone and brains remained. Thus died the Lord of Air, his skull crushed by one of the very cobblestones he had helped the king lay down. As mentioned previously, the Pentoshi have Andal roots, yet Lord Drogo was baselessly accused of bringing the plague upon Westeros. This point isn't really that relevant to the arguments I'm making or responding to, it's just something that I rarely see discussed and there may not be other good moments to bring it up. All I'm going to say is, I think xenophobia should not be seen as a less serious form of prejudice than racism. Later, Hartnett makes interesting observations about Dany's gender influencing her role in the story. How she is a unique blend of masculine and feminine attributes, much like her dragons, who are neither male nor female. I was rocking with this, so I will read it to you without any comments. Like the dragons, throughout the story, Daenerys begins to blur masculine and feminine symbolism. This appears through the funeral pyre, which burns off Daenerys' hair. As Karen Gresham discusses, the absence of Daenerys' beautiful hair, which was burned off in the fire, coupled by the display of her lactating nipples, illustrates her embodiment of the masculine and feminine. The upper stratum is represented by a masculine Western appearance, while the lower stratum is represented by the feminine universal of fertility. This androgyny continues as Daenerys begins to view herself as a leader, adopting more masculine attributes on the way. While traveling, her handmaids garbed her in the skin of the Hrakar Drogo had slain, the wild lion of the Dothraki Sea. Its fearsome head made a hood to cover her naked scalp. It spelled a cloak that flowed across her shoulders and down her back. The lion is a symbol of power and strength, and the pelt serves as a symbol of Drogo's prowess in hunting. Valerie Estelle Frankel argues that, as Daenerys wears Dothraki dress, she's becoming a second Drogo, a male-coded leader. Similarly, as her hair begins to grow back, beginning not as a feminine aspect of herself, but as a sign of her leadership and physical prowess. Dany ran a hand over the top of her head, feeling the new growth. Dothraki men wore their hair in long old braids, and cut them only when defeated. Perhaps I should do the same, she thought, to remind them that Drogo's strength lives with me now. As Gresham analyzes, Daenerys regards her hair and its length as a function of Dothraki masculinity, rather than femininity. She considered it an aspect of her strength and leadership, not a representation of her feminine beauty. My smile died very quickly, however, because Hartnett positioned that the reason why Daenerys chooses Unsullied as her soldiers is to not threaten her newfound masculine power. However, this obscuring of traditional gender roles becomes most obvious in her choice of soldiers. Although a few of her Dothraki warriors remain, Daenerys finds herself on a quest to reclaim the kingdom with no army. She is convinced by Ser Jorah to sail to Astapor to purchase an army of Unsullied, the greatest soldiers in Essos. The Unsullied are made up of slaves selected in childhood and brutally trained until they are masters of spear and shield and shortsword. Absolutely obedient, absolutely loyal, and utterly without fear. The Unsullied are castrated in their youth, but unlike in other cities in Essos where eunuchs are often made by removing a boy's testicles, but leaving the penis, which can only lead to trouble, the Astapori remove the penis as well, leaving nothing. As Gresham states, the Unsullied's sexuality stands beyond the normal reproductive cycle. Its castrated warriors dwell in a distinct gender category that was used for the better part of 1,000 years to represent and uphold social order. Daenerys cannot have male soldiers because that will undermine her masculinized identity, at least in the eyes of her followers. In order to retain the superior masculinized status, Daenerys chooses an army of eunuchs, who, in the patriarchal society of Westeros and Essos, are essentially seen as an army of unmen. That the best soldiers, viewed in Western literature as the embodiment of masculinity, in the East are not men, again plays into Orientalist stereotypes of the East as feminized. The most masculine Oriental men are still not seen as real men. Why does Martin choose to masculinize Daenerys in the series? There are many possible answers. Daenerys' masculinization is used to align her more closely with the patriarchy. As S.M. Shamsul Alam asserts, the colonialist project and colonial order of things were fundamentally of the patriarchal masculine Europe self. The masculine self penetrated the colonial world, thus masculinizing colonization. This binary relationship between the colonial and colonized leads to particular relations of role and forms of knowledge. The forms of knowledge are based on rigid and hierarchical divisions between the colonizers and colonized. The binary relationship between colonizer-colonized is replicated in the binary between masculine and feminine. In order to reaffirm the natural position of the colonizer is portrayed or represented as masculine and the colonized as feminine. This legitimizes the position of the European colonizer over the native colonized. Daenerys, while a female ruler, still serves as a representative of the patriarchy, as she comes from a Western patriarchal society, and her only claim to the throne of Westeros is through patriarchal succession laws. In Essos, her position as queen is tenuous due to her sex. Without patriarchal succession to legitimize her position in Essos, she is masculinized in order to normalize her power. Nonetheless, this blurring of gender throughout the series only serves to further her position as colonizer. There is another way one can view Dany's blend of masculine and feminine attributes. The fact that she was intentionally written as a gendered subversion. Why is Dany a princess and not a prince? I made this choice a long time ago, but I think I wanted to play a little with gender roles and reverse things a little. And of course, Mother of Dragons, to my mind, is much better than Father of Dragons. There is the connection between the woman who brings forth life, carrying a huge power of death, fire, and destruction. There are very powerful metaphors in there. The claim made by Hartnett would have made more credence if Odig Iscari had been feminized in this way, or if it was Daenerys who castrated the Unsullied. This is not what happened. It was the Iscari slavers that castrated their own colonial subjects from all over the world, subjecting them to precisely that feminization Hartnett describes. And rather than to recognize the castration of the Unsullied as their ultimate dehumanization, she considered it yet another expression of Dany's colonialism, a repeated pattern as, in her view, the truly oppressed class in Essos is the slave-owning gentry. She also completely glosses over how Daenerys allows the Unsullied to reclaim their humanity. One of the first things Dany had done after the fall of Astapor was abolish the custom of giving the Unsullied new slave names every day. Most of those born free had returned to their birth names, those who still remembered them, at least. Others had called themselves after heroes or gods, and sometimes weapons, gems, and even flowers, which resulted in soldiers with some very peculiar names to Dany's ears. Grey Worm had remained Grey Worm. When she asked him why, he said, "It is a lucky name. The name this one was born to was accursed. That was the name he had when he was taken for a slave. But Grey Worm is the name this one drew the day Daenerys Stormborn set him free." Compare these passages. Other slaves might steal and hoard up silver in hopes of buying freedom, but an Unsullied would not take it if the little mare offered it as a gift. They have no life outside their duty. They are soldiers. And that is all. "My queen," replied the captain, "your servant Stalwart Shield had no duty last night. He had gone to a certain place to drink and have companionship. A certain place? What do you mean?" "A house of pleasure, your grace." "What could the eunuch hope to find in a brothel? Even those who lack a man's parts may still have a man's heart, your grace," said Grey Worm. "This one has been told that your servant Stalwart Shield sometimes gave coin to the women of the brothels to lie with him and hold him." Once more, Hartnett ignores that the Unsullied are varied in ethnicity, with some of them being ethnically Valyrian, such as Stalwart Shield. The dead man's face was smooth and hairless, though his cheeks had been slashed open ear to ear. He had been a tall man, blue-eyed and fair of face, some child of Lys or old Volantis, snatched off a ship by coursers and sold into bondage in Red Astapor. Stalwart Shield was an Eastern man, just like Daenerys is an Eastern woman. They shared the same ethnicity, as both were ethnic Valyrians. That puts into question the assumption about Daenerys's and the Valyrians' ontological whiteness, because as you remember, Hartnett seems to be under the impression that the Valyrians are very rare in Essos, and that the rest of the continent is darker skinned than Daenerys. There's plenty of Valyrians and other white ethnicities all around Essos, but even if the Valyrians were somehow more white than them, neither Daenerys, nor Stalwart Shield, nor the Valyrians that came before them are Western. Like the Iscari, the Valyrians are an amalgamation of different cultural inspirations. They are a bit like Romans and the Greeks, but their affinity with dragons is decidedly Eastern. In contrast to the West, in the Eastern cultures, and in East Asian cultures in particular, dragons are seen as benevolent creatures. Chinese people especially hold them in high regard and claim to descend from dragons, which is very similar to the claims made by the Valyrians. This is why I was always very fond of the East Asian Valyrians headcanons. The connections the Valyrians had to the ancient Egypt that I mentioned at the beginning of this very long video are additionally reinforced by the existence of Valyrian sphinxes. The next evening they came upon a huge Valyrian sphinx crouched beside the road. It had a dragon's body and a woman's face. "A dragon queen," said Tyrion, "a pleasant omen." What is even more, the Valyrians held magic and sorcery in very high regard, in stark contrast to the West, where magic and sorcery were disparaged. due to the Christian cultural influence. As such, the Valyrians were white, but they were decidedly not Western. Yet, in order to mark Daenerys as a Western, white other, Hartnett must ignore that Daenerys is very much Eastern, both ethnically and culturally, and put all the Unsullied into one big Oriental bag, even though Daenerys and Stalwart Shield were of the same ethnicity, the same culture, probably spoke the same language, looked the same, and were both Eastern. Hartnett then once more pathologizes Daenerys' relative gender nonconformity and considers it a sign of colonialism and not a deliberate gendered subversion as intended by the author. Through her travels, Daenerys adopts masculine traits in order to maintain a position of dominance over those in Essos. However, this masculinity is not enough to maintain power, and she sees violent uprisings consume the cities she has conquered and abandoned. She also faces strong opposition within the city of Meereen as she attempts to stay and rule. Therefore, she turns to her race to solidify her dominance. She assumes that her whiteness will allow her to rule as queen and eventually gain enough power to return and take the throne of Westeros, which would be otherwise denied from her because of her sex. Westeros itself is still the locus of the various narrative threads. Daenerys, for example, is constantly seeking a way to gain power and an army to lead back there to reclaim the throne of her dynasty, Young. Daenerys' true goal in Essos is, and has always been, to leverage her whiteness to compensate for her gender for her return to Westeros. While it was undoubtedly a mistake for Daenerys to leave Yunkai and Astapor, it's also not entirely honest to position Daenerys as having just abandoned these cities. Someone unfamiliar with the story could assume that Dany came, conquered, plundered, and left, when what happens instead was this. Dany had left Astapor in the hands of a council of former slaves, led by a healer, a scholar, and a priest. Wise men all, she thought, and just. And while that council ultimately gets overthrown because there's no military power to enforce the new order, attempts at giving the freedmen self-determination were made. In Yunkai, she specifically orders the slavers to compensate their slaves. On the morning of the third day, send out your slaves, all of them. Every man, woman and child shall be given a weapon, and as much food, clothing, coin, and goods as he or she can carry. These they shall be allowed to choose freely from among their master's possessions, as payment for their years of servitude. When all the slaves have departed, you will open your gates and allow by Unsullied to enter and search your city. If you do this, Yunkai will not be burned or plundered. That was ultimately a mistake too, as Daenerys indeed does not sack Yunkai, but they resume slaving as soon as she leaves. However, by ignoring these details, Hartnett's obfuscations continue, and that's done to further the narrative that Dany comes, conquers, plunders, and abandons these cities without sparing them a single thought. Attempts, although futile, were made to keep the new order intact, and the failures of Astapor still haunt Daenerys. Your Grace could not have saved them, said Ser Barristan. You warned King Cleon against this war with Yunkai. The man was a fool, and his hands were red with blood. And are my hands any cleaner? She remembered what Dario had said, that all kings must be butchers, or meat. Cleon was the enemy of our enemy. If I had joined him at the horns of Hazad, we might have crushed the Yunkai between us. The Shafepay disagreed. If you had taken the Unsullied south to Hazad, the Sons of the Harpy, I know. It is Irohe all over again. Bramben Plum was puzzled. Who is Irohe? A girl I thought I'd saved from rape and torment. All I did was make it worse for her in the end. And all I did in Astapor was make 10,000 Irohes. Your Grace could not have known. I am the Queen. It was my place to know. By all means, we can criticize Dany's approach, but let's keep our criticism good faith, shall we? What is more, Hartnett does not really elaborate on the strong opposition within the city of Meereen. She cannot elaborate because that is yet another obfuscation. The opposition to her rule comes not from concerned citizens of Meereen, but specifically from one group of people, the former Meereenese slaving gentry, who call themselves Sons of the Harpy. Each night, they murder the freedmen and her soldiers. Attewell believes that they are meant to parallel the KKK. The closest and most politically pertinent parallel to Reconstruction is the case of the Sons of the Harpy. Those fans who argue for an Iraq metaphor cite the Sons of the Harpy as equivalent to the post-invasion Iraqi insurgency. However, political terrorism was not invented in 2003, and the much closer historical parallel is the Ku Klux Klan and the other white supremacist terrorist organizations that emerged in the 1860s and 1870s. In addition to the frequent use of assassinations and the use of symbolism and propaganda to spread fear, with the harpy writ in blood standing in for a burning cross, the targets of the Sons of the Harpy closely parallel those of the clan. While the Sons of the Harpy attack Dany's military on a few occasions, their most frequent target are freedmen who are attempting to assert their newfound independence, either by political activism or upward mobility. Hence businessmen and craftsmen, hence the freedman leader Rilonari, and freedmen who join in Dany's new militia. But the last is equally important and revealing. The weavers murdered are the same freedwomen that Grazdan Zogalare had compensation for training while there were slaves, and this murder is both a statement to the ex-slaves of Meereen about what happens to those who try to rise above their station, and a statement about Dany's interference with the rights of the Great Masters. The Sons of the Harpy, like the clan and unlike the Iraqi insurgency, hold as their major objective the economic and political suppression of an entire class of ex-slaves, and ultimately their submission under a new regime led by former Great Masters like Hizdar Zolorak, Reznak Moreznak, and the Green Grace. This is one of the reasons why not only do I reject the Iraq reading, I am disgusted by it. To make this parallel is to equate domestic terrorists similar to the clan with the anti-US resistance in Iraq, and while Hartnett does not single out Iraq as the primary stand-in for Meereen, but the broader Middle East, the implications remain. If we accept her reading of the story with Daenerys as the colonial invader, then the freedmen of Meereen are colonial collaborators, whereas the Sons of the Harpy, who murder and rape the freed slaves, are the anti-colonial resistance. Truly a puzzling position to take. Hartnett then compares Daenerys to white women who venture into Africa as a power trip, as their whiteness grants them power over racialized subjects they otherwise don't have back home, and continues, her race allowed her to marry into power. Likewise, her identity as a white savior positions her above the people she is conquering, allowing her to gain more power and rule as a queen. And like other white women during colonization, she is using her race in foreign locales to overcome her sex in patriarchal locations. In her exile, Daenerys is using her presumed superiority through her whiteness to conquer eastern, non-white peoples with the eventual goal of returning to Westeros to reclaim her rightful throne. Daenerys is leveraging her whiteness to gain an army to overcome her sex. Even after she has conquered the city and is actively ruling, Meereen falls into economic problems, and a group of citizens, called the Sons of the Harpy, rise in resistance. The Sons of the Harpy killed freed slaves, Daenerys' soldiers, and Meereenese citizens who have accepted Daenerys' rule and have begun to adopt Westerosi fashions. We already covered why I don't think Dany's Valyrian ethnicity gives her power, quite the opposite. Once more, the votes of the Giscari gentry are placed in importance ahead of the sea of their slaves from all over the world, including their own. We have an acknowledgement of what the Sons of the Harpy do, yet with no thought as to what the reading of the Dany colonizer implies, that those who murder and rape freed slaves are the true anti-colonial resistance. Additionally, Hartnett again obfuscates reality. She claims that the Meereenese now adopt Westerosi fashions without elaborating how that manifests. It took me a while to realize what she meant. I went back to the chapter she referenced, sure that something crucial missed me, and came to the stunning realization that she means the shave braids. Giscari hair was dense and wiry. It had long been the fashion for the men of the slaver cities to tease it into horns and spikes and wings. By shaving, Skahaz had put old Meereen behind him to accept the new, and his kin had done the same after his example. Others followed, though whether from fear, fashion, or ambition, Dany could not say. Shave braids, they were called. Skahaz was the shave braid, and the vials of traitors to the Sons of the Harpy and their ilk. To call shaving one's head adopting Westerosi fashions is an obfuscation that serves a broader narrative, that Dany forces the Meereenese to adapt her culture and values. However, the shaved head isn't a unique Westerosi fashion. Skahaz shaving his head isn't an adoption of the Westerosi fashions, but the rejection of the Meereenese ones. This is yet another reconstruction parallel. In any counter-insurgency, you're going to get some faction of the population that supports the new regime. However, the way in which Skahaz's shift transcends the political to encompass a social and cultural revolution, and includes an alliance between the Shavebraids and the freedmen, suggests a very specific historical counterpart. The so-called Skalavag. Disparagingly named after a kind and ranty horse, the Scalawag's of American Reconstruction were Southern white Unionists, residents of the mountainous regions of West Virginia, East Tennessee, the Western Carolinas, and Northern Alabama, who had resisted secession from the outset, as well as Southerners from other regions who had turned their backs on the Confederacy during the war, through draft resistance or desertion, or after the war, most famously the former Confederate General James Longstreet, who would go on to lead African-American state militias against the paramilitary White League in Louisiana. Like the Scalawags, the Shavepates form a vital part of Danis revolutionary coalition, willing to take up arms against a terrorist movement that views them as collaborators and traitors to their people. Like the Shavepates, the Scalawags bitterly resented the former ruling class of the South and held deep grudges for their treatment during the war when Confederate armies had occupied Unionist areas of the South. Thus, most calls for the disenfranchisement of former rebels and the redistribution of the plantations came from the South, not the North. Thus, Skahas urges a consistent policy of meeting violence with violence, in a belief that Skal, Haskar, Gazen, Merek, Lorak, all the old slaving families, Pal most of all, are Danis enemies. And while his ruthless methods come in for a lot of disdain from the fandom, you do have to admit that these families are almost certainly part of the Sons of the Harpy, and thus out to kill him, his supporters and allies, and anyone else who tries to challenge the social hierarchy. The unrest and violence are blamed entirely on them. In addition, the fact that the citizens have not adapted to her rule is never blamed on Daenerys or her misunderstanding of Meereenese culture. Instead, it is attributed to the unsuitability of the Meereenese. Daenerys laments that the former Yunkai slaves were mostly trained as bed slaves. She claims that brothels had sprouted up like mushrooms all over Meereen. It is all they know. Roman argues that her failures are because her liberation is for the good, but the ideal of liberation is met with the reality of the people. The reality of the people seems to be that the former slaves are unable to move beyond their training as bed slaves, and thus resort to prostitution, just as the former slave owners are unable to move beyond their past and seek a return to slavery and violence. The problem lies not with Daenerys or with her subjugation of another race of people that she never takes the time to fully understand. Instead, it is the Meereenese people, and thus the people of Essos and everyone other, who are not capable of adapting to the superior ways of Daenerys and Westeros. Here, Danis' observations that the former slaves are unable to move beyond the only thing they were taught is taken as a sign of her feelings of superiority and not of the violence that the slavers unleash on their slaves. The Yunkish freedmen have no other skill because since childhood, they were only taught sexual pleasure. They can't move past that because they have only recently been freed and have no other skill or ways to obtain them. Then, Hartnett ignores that many freedmen do find ways to advance socially, like the Weaver women that the anti-colonial resistance, the Sons of the Harpy, murdered. And finally, Hartnett officially touches upon the TV show and Daenerys burning King's Landing. Fans decried this as something Daenerys was never capable of and accused the show's writers of character assassination. This, of course, missed the primary core of Daenerys' story, vengeance. She frequently threatened to take back what she saw as hers with fire and blood. When my dragons are grown, we will take back what was stolen from me and destroy those who have wronged me. We will lay waste to armies and burn cities to the ground, Garden of Bones. And she demonstrates this streak of violence and revenge throughout the series. She executes 163 Meereenese nobles for the 163 slave children she found dead on her way to Meereen. The show goes out of its way to demonstrate that it was not a fair action when we are presented with his Zolorak, a nobleman whose father was killed despite his protests against the murder and crucifixion of the slave children, the loss of gods and men. Hizdahr wants to provide a proper burial for his father, something Daenerys is fervently against and must be convinced into. This echoes the actions in Sophocles' classic play Antigone, when the noble resist the unfair edicts of a tyrannical ruler. Daenerys later burns the head of a Meereenese noble family to death with dragonfire, and allows her dragons to eat him, despite no proven wrongdoings on his part, in vengeance for the murder of her advisor, Kill the Boy, only a few episodes after requiring a public trial for a member of her council who openly admits to killing a prisoner, the House of Black and White. However, these actions are not regarded as cruel or evil, like her later actions in King's Landing. By doing so, she continues her streak of placing more value on the victimhood of the Meereenese slaving gentry ahead of the murdered slave children and the freedmen the Sons of the Harpy targeted. Remember how D&D wanted to write a show where the Confederacy won? Seems relevant here. Having read this essay a couple of times now, there's one underlying problem I have with it. I am not sure what argument Hartnett is even making. On one hand, she criticizes George's Orientalist writing, but at other times, it seems like she considered some of it to be a deliberate writing choice to make Daenerys into the Orientalist. Similarly, she acknowledges that George R. R. Martin rejected readings for A Song of Ice and Fire that have to do with US imperialism, but at other times, outright states that Martin did deliberately wrote Daenerys as an imperialist. Therefore, it's unclear if, in her eyes, Martin makes an analogy, or if he was subconsciously influenced by the PR machine of US imperialism. Something I don't find very likely, given Martin's principal opposition to it. He was a conscious objector to the Vietnam War. I often hear that everyone is allowed to interpret this story how they want. I agree with this, with a caveat. Provided you make text-based arguments and make a strong case. Being the dialectical materialist that I am, colonialism to me is first and foremost about economic exploitation, and the author failed to provide tangible examples of Danish economic exploitation of the Bay. All the theoretical post-colonial framework in the world won't be enough if the text contradicts you. When the essay did try to make other arguments, it relied on obfuscations to make the point, such as the claim of the Meereenese adapting Westerosi fashions. For once the full context of who exactly the Shavepates are is provided, the narrative isn't as easy to sell. And there's also that entirely unfounded claim that Daenerys is basically establishing residential schools. Another persistent pattern was the focus on the alleged oppression faced by the Giscari at the hands of Daenerys, which necessarily implies prioritizing the vows of the slaving gentry of Essos ahead of the exploitation of their slaves. This by itself stems from the lack of recognition of the transnational and transcontinental nature of slavery in Planetos, which in turn comes from exactly one unfortunate visual from the show. Slavery is not unique to the Giscari. Most of the slaves in the Bay aren't Giscari. The Giscari also enslaved their own. And what is the most important to note here is that Daenerys didn't save all these people. They saved themselves. She was merely a catalyst that launched something that is already far bigger than herself. This arrogant child has taken it upon herself to smash the slave trade, but that traffic was never confined to Slaver's Bay. It was part of the sea of trade that spanned the world, and the Dragon Queen has clouded the water. Behind the Black Wall, lords of ancient blood sleep poorly. Listening to their kitchen slaves sharpen their long knives, slaves grow our food, clean our streets, teach our young. They guard our walls, row our galleys, fight our battles. And now when they look east, they see this young queen shining from afar, this breaker of chains. The old blood cannot suffer that. Poor men hate her too. Even the vilest beggar stands higher than a slave. This dragon queen would rob him of that consolation. The word of Dany's campaign reached the entire world. The Volantine slaves sharpen their knives. They want their oppressors gone and are an active force in making it the reality. And when she does decide to try and compromise with the slaving gentry, the former slaves are in disbelief. Daenerys Targaryen was wed, the guards on the pens had told them, laughing. She had taken a Meereenese slaver as her king, as wealthy as he was noble, and when the peace was signed and sealed, the fighting pits of Meereen would open once again. Other slaves insisted that the guards were lying, that Daenerys Targaryen would never make peace with slavers. Misa, they called her. Someone told him that meant mother. Soon the Silver Queen would come forth from her city, smash the Yunkai, and break their chains, they whispered to one another. Daenerys is seen as a savior by these people. They don't want her to back away from the campaign, and they certainly don't complain about their destroyed culture, as the destroyed culture isn't theirs and never has been. They want her to burn the entire institution to the ground, and, as exemplified by the Volantine slaves, they are ready to die for that cause. This is why I consider Atterwald's insight into this storyline to be so crucial, as it is the only relatively popular reading that I've seen that does not conclude with Daenerys should seek moderation and compromise. Moderation and compromise is what the slavers want. The Meereenese want to replicate the conditions of slavery as much as they can, much like the southern slave owners, while Yunkai and Astapor straight up go back to slaving. I cannot think of any other way Daenerys should have acted in this scenario. To turn her back on the slaves would be an unforgivable betrayal. Taking action, in turn, gets her labeled a colonizer, a Western white other, imposing her Western, American values on the Middle Easterners. I agree that George can sometimes be careless with his real-world inspirations, but rather than to criticize his racist and Orientalist bias, these readings end up vindicating said biases. We should expect better of him. Christopher Roman, the author to whom Hartnett had some harsh words, put it this way. Ethics forces Daenerys to be responsible and vulnerable. In freeing the cities of Astapor and Yunkai and Meereen, Daenerys is forging a space for the victim to speak. And as such, I cannot think of a better way to end this video than to do what Daenerys does herself. Give the voice to these slaves. Should you reach your queen, give her a message from the slaves of Old Volantis. She touched the faded scar upon her wrinkled cheek, where her tears had been cut away. Tell her we are waiting. Tell her to come soon. And like them, I hope she comes with fire and blood. Thanks for watching. Remember that if you like my videos, like, subscribe and share, so that more people can see it. Make sure to click the notification button, so that you never miss a new video. And remember, Phoenix rises from the ashes, and ashes always land on top.